Hi, this is Siofra Bradigan, and this is Siofra's Magic Alcove. I'm not sure what I'm going to call this video, but I just wanted to talk about some of the things, you know, that have been brought up in the last few weeks or so. So we'll just jump in and see where I end up. Um, Willing something into being. So in the creating your own reality video, we talked a little bit about that subject, but I wanted to elaborate on some of the confusion that people might have on to exactly how that happens and what does and doesn't work. So when I was thinking about this subject, one of the things that came to mind was just wishing isn't enough. It and even having everyone on the planet wishing for the exact same thing doesn't necessarily get results. And it's one of those open ended things. Why not? And when I'm talking about that, for example, end of times, there is a lot, there are a lot of people out there that are constantly focused on and energized by the idea of the world coming to an end. And whenever anything happens in the world, especially any bad thing happens in the world, then a group of people are going to jump on that and say this is an indication that the world is coming to an end. We're in the end times. If you look at Wikipedia, they actually have a page just on end times prophecies and how often they happen. And it's rather interesting to note in the beginning, they were fairly far apart, and now they get closer and closer together. It's like we have several every year almost at this point. So, thinking about the fact that here are all these people that are focused on the idea that their neighbors and the people that aren't members of their particular congregation are going to die a horrible and terrible death with disease and war and famine and all the other things, and they're going to escape because they're special. It's like it kind of concerns me a little bit just from a personal level that there are so many people hoping that, me and people like me will die in a horrible manner. But it brings up the point that so many people are thinking that it hasn't happened. And just because everybody or a large group of people are focused on a single outcome doesn't mean it's actually going to take place. So that's just one example of that kind of thing. And um, I think it's because it's too big. It's like it's trying to influence too many lives at once, like everyone on the planet, as it were. And I think the reason why smaller uh, wishes, prayers, and so forth work is because they're more focused. So, for example, a neighbor's kid gets into a terrible car accident or gets an illness or something and ends up in the hospital, and the whole town starts to focus on sending them positive energy and hoping that they will survive. It doesn't always work, but it seems to work fairly often. And certainly that kind of focused energy seems to have more of an impact on our universe and how we interact with it. So I think that that is probably one of the main reasons is because it's not like a grand wish for all of the planet or a hope or desire or, whatever, but it is a very specific targeted type of thing that someone is putting their energy into. And I think probably one of the reasons why I'm so into the healing stuff is because of that, because I've had a lot of different experiences with both in person and distance healing that I have no doubt that that works. And I think that the mechanism has to do with that sharing our energy for a unified goal for positive impact. And the universe in general, the way it's set up is more for life than it is working towards death in that sense. So, like human bodies, for example, when they're ill, anything that can help them move forward towards more life is going to have more energy and power to it than something that's trying to move the body towards death and demise, because it's got more of the universal life force energy working in the same direction. It's sort of like jumping onto the right tide, current, or whatever. And so, it's like there are definitely people who get caught up in the idea of being able to impact more people in a larger sense and so forth, which leads to some unhealthy situations like cult leaders and, getting people on board with what they're doing and so forth. I don't know if it's just an ego thing or if it's a combination of other stuff. It's hard to tell for sure, really, except that they end badly for the people who end up becoming a part of it. It's like their energy is drained and sucked off, and their will to live is transformed into something else completely different, um, and becomes a self-centered, absorbed, egocentric kind of situation. And I think that there is a definite difference in how um, the universe responds to completely selfish ends for with the um, potential for harm for others versus more, I don't know what to call it, not pure motives, but more, you know, towards life improving and getting better kind of motivations or something. I don't know how to explain this, but the evidence seems to indicate that that's the case, at least from what I've seen. Um, we had that discussion just recently about whether you can use your gifts for, uh, personal gain or whatever, and I think we covered that part of the subject pretty well. But then there's another piece. Is like, what are people talking about when they say harm none? And that's another subject that came up, um, where we've all done things that we've regretted that have turned out badly, whether someone has been harmed by it directly or indirectly. But, we're imperfect, struggling, trying to understand and figure things out. And it's impossible to live a life without harming someone or something. It isn't feasible at all. And yet we put this kind of pressure on ourselves to be able to rise to a standard of awareness and comprehension and understanding and so forth that is an impossible standard to actually meet, the idea of becoming perfect. And I've always had trouble with the idea of becoming perfect. I mean, one of my survival tactics when I was a child was to think I needed to be perfect. That was sort of an incredibly intense focus of mine, because the idea that if I was perfect, everything around me would be perfect. And so it's a thing I've struggled with for a fair amount of my life, and trying to get to the point where it's okay that I'm not perfect and that making mistakes is normal and helps you to learn and grow, has been a challenge to say the least. So, um, so when we put that kind of pressure on ourselves, we create a no-win scenario. It isn't possible for us to succeed at being our idea of perfect, because it doesn't really exist. And then there's the other part of me that says perfect means the end of all things. It's like, if you're actually perfect, then there's no room for you to grow. There's no thing for you to learn. There's no where or place for you to be, because you have arrived. You are now perfect. And that sounds like death, worse than death. Because to me, death would mean I would go into the ground, maybe if I'm lucky, and nurture other life forms, and I would move on and go on maybe to another life, or what have you. There would be opportunity for me to experience, to grow, or at the least, even without all that, to influence and and sustain the environment around me, because life is not about just life, it's about transformation and death as well, because everything is constantly changing from one form to another. And that includes our ideas, and parts of our personality, our perceptions of reality. Uh, if we get ourselves stuck into a philosophy that says this is it, this is like the goal has been reached and there's nowhere else to go, then we are static and we stagnate. And, it's like, and then we become defensive trying to maintain that idea that we have arrived and there's nowhere else for us to go. It's sort of a weird inner conflict sort of thing. And, back to the idea of harm, um, on a purely simplistic level, every time you take a breath, you're killing things. You're killing microorganisms. Every time the air lands on your skin is killing stuff. It's got a pH layer on there, an acidic layer that will like zap other forms of life to keep them from invading you. It's part of our defense mechanism. And whenever we defend ourselves, even without knowing it, other things, their demise is assured or our demise is assured. It's like one or the other. It's like, you've got this whole battle thing going on when you're trying to stay alive. And everything consumes something else. There is no form of life, animal, or, well, I don't know about vegetables. I'd have to think about, no, even vegetables. Everything consumes something, on some level, even if it's a basic level. So with plants, they consume the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. They consume the light and the energy. They consume the minerals and the nutrients and stuff that are in the soil, and pull them up into their bodies. And in some cases, leave the soil depleted. Some plants work on putting that back into the soil, so it becomes a bit of a balancing act, obviously. Otherwise, everything would just be sucked up and dead. But even plant life has that kind of a cycle, and then of course it doesn't exist forever, and then it dies and it decomposes, and other things come in and eat the decomposing material that the plant has left and turn that into nutrients in the soil, and the cycle starts all over again. So, you know, um, there are a fair number of people that are in following this path who decide for one reason or another to be vegan or vegetarian, and it is a wonderful form of lifestyle. I have nothing wrong, I have nothing to say against it at all. But some of them get very self-righteous about their choice, in that they feel that they have managed to pick something that doesn't harm other things, because they're not hurting animals anymore, and yet they are consuming plants, which is a life form. So that's the thing, is like, we shouldn't be fooling ourselves that we're better than we are, or trying to make whatever we're doing into something better than what someone else is doing, just because. I mean, it's just a personal choice. It's like what works for your body, what works for your lifestyle, what works for the area that you're in, what works for your circumstances. It's like, trying to survive. You do it however you can. And you shouldn't be putting yourself down for not being able to be a vegan or a vegetarian if you've got special needs, or it's just not a circumstance that you're able to do. It's not like this is a requirement in order to be a good pagan, a good witch, a good magician, or whatever. It's like everybody is different. And we need to not point fingers at one another for that. I mean, I'm great. I was a vegetarian for 17 years and I enjoyed it thoroughly, and it's probably good for my body. Ian can't be one because he has these special needs for iron and all sorts of other stuff, and allergic reactions to things and whatnot. So, I'm trying to adapt to him, and we're doing what we can. But even as a vegetarian, I wasn't running around telling people who were eating meat that they were evil and there was something wrong with them or they were stupid and they were unenlightened or what have you. The name calling kind of stuff is something I don't understand. And it sort of, annoys me and saddens me, frankly. I mean, we have enough things we're already yelling at each other for. We really don't need to manufacture more things. And I think that idea that one form of diet is better than another has led to some pretty sketchy situations altogether. Um, I mean, I told you about the one with me and the wheatgrass juice and discovering my body letting me know I couldn't have it, and then me telling the person who suggested it that I couldn't take it because I was allergic to it, and her insane declaration that I couldn't be allergic to it because it was good for me. And of course, my counter argument is if it kills me, it's not good for me. That's like a big, big no no. And I met a woman in Wairika who was allergic to eggs, and her children cooked her a birthday cake. Oh, they cooked a birthday cake for the grandkids, and instead of, in their minds, catering to her delusion that she was allergic to eggs, they put eggs in it and told her it was egg free, and then we're going to be surprised. You're not allergic to eggs, it's all in your mind. And she ended up in a coma for 3 days and almost died. So we need to listen to each other instead of projecting ourselves onto everybody else. It's like what's good for me is not necessarily good for you. And I know this. And I try to keep that in mind when we're talking about all of the subjects that we talk about because we're all in different levels, different states, learning different lessons, and that's okay. It doesn't have to all be the same. Where it doesn't need to be identical. There doesn't need to be a single string that goes through that connects everything together so that it all makes sense. Like the universal string theory. It's not. It's not the way it is. And the fact that we live in a universe filled with chaos and explosions and, you know, events that are unpredictable, or at least most of the time unpredictable, you know, uh, that doesn't mean we're doing something wrong if we happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and in the middle of an earthquake. I felt like that though when I was in the earthquake in Santa Cruz that happened in '89. I was very upset and very offended, that the planet would do this to me after I'd been so nice to it all these years. It was like, why are you doing this? I've never been nothing but nice to you. Um, and, coming to the realization that this kind of stuff isn't personal, it's much bigger than us. And that's part of the projection problem. We project these things on people, on things, on plants, on animals, on philosophies, on countries, on religions. It doesn't matter what it is. Most people are constantly trying to figure out how what they're doing is okay. And the only way they can seem to figure out that it's okay is if it's better than what someone else is doing because what they're doing is not okay. And the comparison thing, we should be over this by now. Yeah, right. That's really silly of me. But it would be nice if we were over this by now and stop trying to compare ourselves to everything else out there or our lifestyle and what our choices are and what we like to eat that everyone else should be doing too. Um, and again, it definitely boils down to projection. So there's no doubt that the world is complicated and things are not simple. And there's a lot of stuff for each of us to work out. But, you know, we need to be okay with not knowing all the answers and not being perfect and giving ourselves a break because it's that desire to maintain the illusion of perfection that often keeps us from noticing things about ourselves because to pay attention to them, to notice them, to acknowledge them means to admit we're not perfect and we've maybe failed in some way. So to me, the whole idea of and ye harm none is to sort of give you an opportunity to take a breath and evaluate what you're about to do if you're doing something on a magical level. And to think about the possibility of consequences, both intended and unintended, because, we never know for sure exactly how far something may have an impact or how little. I mean, it's a big universe. And is a big question. And that thing with the butterfly on the one side of the planet causing a hurricane on the other. That's sort of that kind of idea. Um, and be okay with trying it and see what happens, because we're small enough in the larger scheme of the universe that if we make a few mistakes, it's not going to bring the whole thing down on our heads. That's the other thing. It's not going to bring the whole thing down on our heads. Eventually, of course, everything will be down and on our heads, but that's way in the future. And that's just the nature of reality. It comes, it blossoms, it grows, and then it dissipates, and then it dies, and then it vanishes, and then the whole thing hopefully starts all over again. But when I'm watching the news, I had a conversation about this with someone the other day, because the news right now is pretty horrific and terrifying, frankly, because it's just happened as I'm making this video that Russia has decided to take Ukraine. And what's going on there, I can't even begin to comprehend how terrifying and scary and horrific the whole thing is. And the aftermath of this is just going to be a long time to recover from. But when I watch things like that on the news, either local or national or international in this case, I try to look at it and think to myself, is there anything I personally can do to affect this situation? Like, do I know someone who's in a position of power who can do something about this? Am I on a committee or a member of government, or, whatever it is? And the answer is no, I'm not. And so there's nothing I can do to affect it. And getting to the point where I can recognize that and be okay with the fact that there are certain things that I personally cannot do anything about, then I can take in the information and then move on with what I'm doing here. The dream that I had about the storm, I shared on my Facebook page, but I don't think I've shared with the group at large. Happened the day before this whole thing started breaking apart in between Russia and Ukraine. And I had one of my storm dreams where there was this big, huge black cloud. I was in a bit of a building, so some kind of a shelter, like a storm shelter kind of thing, where you can watch storms coming. And this big cloud suddenly descended down upon the building, and it looked like it was going to come into the building and just sit on the ground, and then we would be inside of this cloud, which freaked me the heck out when I was in the dream. And I'm like cringing and so forth and yelling at it, and just before it actually entered the building, it stopped and then it went back up. So I knew something big was coming and it was going to be bad, but apparently I will survive it. At least that's what I think the dream means. Um, but that's just my super conscious or my other self or whatever trying to give me a message and and warn me, you know. And then the next day, it hit the fan. So it's interesting, but I'm not taking myself too seriously as far as that goes. It's just somehow I have these dreams that tell me about things that are happening around me and how close they're going to get to me and all this other stuff. It's just sort of interesting. Um, so I'm not surprised by what's happened because of the dream. What can you do? Anyway, so I guess that's the main message I want to get out with this video. It has to do with the fact that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and we cannot live a life where no harm ever befalls any life form around us because we consume life, and we make mistakes because we're not perfect, which is not a bad thing. Not a bad thing to not be perfect. So hopefully, I don't know if this helps anybody. I always like hearing whether it does or not from you guys. Because sometimes I sit here and I think to myself, am I babbling insanely and just going out of my mind? Or is this really making an impact. So it's always nice to know when it makes sense to people. Um, and if it generates other questions that you want to have more of my opinion on, I guess. So I hope everybody is doing well wherever you are in the world, and our hopes are with everybody out there, um, to stay safe as well as you can, and uh, and hopefully we'll come out the other side of this entire world situation that we're having at the moment. So this has been Siofra's Magick Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. Blessed be.